I want you to, just for a second, mentally rewind the clock. Go back with me to the fall of 2001. The world has just been turned upside down by 9/11. Everyone is on edge. There's this, collective trauma. And then just a week later, something else starts to happen.
Yeah.
Letters. They start showing up at media outlets, at senators' offices, and they have this white powder inside. It's anthrax.
It was such a terrifying 1-2 punch. First, you have this, massive external threat, and then suddenly the threat is like in your own mailbox. It's domestic. It's invisible.
Exactly. And for a lot of us, I think that memory is kind of a blur of like hazmat suits and those constant news tickers. But eventually the FBI did close the case. They pinned it all on a scientist named Bruce Ivins in 2008. He tragically took his own life, and the Department of Justice basically said, okay, case closed.
Right. The file is stamped and put away.
But today we are diving into a source. It's a script titled Episode 7, What Never Fully Closed. And it suggests that phrase, case closed, is actually a very complicated thing.
It really is. Yeah. And this source isn't really interested in relitigating the forensics or trying to do another whodunit. It's doing something, I think, much more interesting. It's analyzing the anatomy of an ending.
The anatomy of an ending. I like that.
Yeah. How do a massive, sprawling federal investigation actually stop? And maybe more importantly, what gets crushed in the gears when it does?
That's the hook for me. Because we usually think of an ending as a fact, right? The movie ends, the credits roll, the case ends, they got the bad guy.
But this source argues there's a huge difference between an investigation ending on paper and ending in reality.
Which is a distinction we almost never make.
So let's start right there. The source opens with this really stark line. Speaker A says, investigations end on paper. And Speaker B says, not always in reality. But then there's this kicker. Speaker A says, this one does.
Yeah.
It feels like they're admitting, right up front, that the official narrative is a closed loop, period. Well, think about what ending on paper really means for an institution like the FBI. This was the largest investigation in its history. They called it a Anthrax. It was hundreds of thousands of man-hours, years of just immense pressure.
Right.
So ending on paper isn't some philosophical concept for them. It's a bureaucratic necessity. You have to file a final report. You have to sign off on the budget. You need to be able to tell the director, we're done.
But isn't that a good thing? I mean, we don't want cases staying open forever, just aimlessly spending our tax dollars. We want a result. If they say it was Bruce Ivins and they close the file, isn't that the system working?
In a functional sense, yes. The system absolutely requires a stop point. But what this source is highlighting is the friction,
Yeah.
The friction between that bureaucratic stop and the reality of the case.
And the reality was messy.
The reality of the Anthrax letters was incredibly messy. It was full of contradictions. So when the FBI closed the file on Ivins, they presented a very specific, very tidy narrative. He was a lone wolf, mentally unstable, had the access, and his motive was that his vaccine program was failing. That's the paper ending. It's neat.
But you're saying the reality wasn't.
Not at all. And the source argues that, while the paper trail stopped, the reality of what happened didn't just magically resolve itself because a report got filed. The doubts didn't just vanish. That fear didn't retroactively make sense. The source says this one does end, and it's sort of acknowledging that official stamp, but it's also implying that the stamp is just ink. It doesn't actually cover up all the cracks in the foundation.
Okay, so let's talk about those cracks, because the next section in our source material is titled Unanswered Questions. And I have to be honest, usually when I hear that phrase, unanswered questions, I kind of roll my eyes a little. It sounds like internet conspiracy fodder,
Right. It usually means someone is about to cherry pick a bunch of data to prove their point.
Exactly. But the source frames this so differently. It says unanswered questions, not because they were ignored, but because they never fit into the conclusion, and that phrasing stopped me.
Yeah.
Because they never fit.
It's a crucial distinction. It really is. The source is arguing that the FBI didn't necessarily ignore evidence in some malicious way.
Yeah.
They weren't burning documents in a trash can. The data is all there. The problem is structural.
Okay.
Imagine you're building a puzzle. You've decided, based on your best lead, that the final picture is a cat. So you're assembling all the pieces that look like a cat, the whiskers, the pointy ears.
Yeah, I'm with you.
But then you get to the end and you have 5 or 6 pieces left over. The real pieces, they came from the same box, but they look like they belong to a dog. And if you try to force those dog pieces into your cat picture, you just ruin the image. You can't finish it. So
yeah,
What do you do with the dog pieces?
You put them back in the box and close the lid.
You put them back in the box.
Exactly.
They become misfit questions.
Hmm.
In the Anthrax case, these weren't small details. For example, there were huge scientific debates about whether Bruce Ivans even had the equipment to dry the spores into that fine powder found in the letters. That's a highly technical, really difficult process.
Right.
And some of his own colleagues argued he physically couldn't have done it in his lab without leaving a massive, obvious trace.
And that's a dog piece.
That is a massive dog piece. If your conclusion is Ivans did it alone in his lab, that piece of evidence just doesn't fit. So for the investigation to end on paper, that question has to be, well, not ignored, but deprioritized. It gets labeled an anomaly and filed away.
But that's so frustrating. I mean, if I'm a member of the public, I'm thinking, wait a minute, if he couldn't actually make the weapon, he's not the guy. Why does the system accept a conclusion that has leftovers?
Because the alternative is an open file. Forever. And the source makes this point later on. The legal system, the political system, they run on narrative coherence. You can't go to a press conference and say, well, we're pretty sure it's this guy, but honestly, the science is kind of 50-50 and we have no idea how he did it.
That's not a conclusion, that's a shrug.
It's a shrug. And you can't close the biggest case in your history with a shrug. So you trade total accuracy for a functional resolution. The source says these questions never fit into the conclusion. The conclusion itself is a container. It has a specific shape, and if the facts are too jagged, they get left out. It's not necessarily a conspiracy, it's just a limitation of how we tell stories about crime. We want a villain, a weapon, a motive. We don't want it's complicated.
That is a little disturbing, though. It implies that every case-closed headline we see might just be the version of the story that had the fewest leftover pieces, not necessarily the one that used all the pieces.
I think that's a very fair assessment. And it leads us right into the next big idea in the source, which is this concept of the hierarchy of memory. This was the part that really broke down all the different players in this drama.
Yeah, let me quote the source here because the wording is just so good. It says, "For the public, closure is enough. For the system, it's necessary. For history, it's complicated."
I love that breakdown. It explains the motivation of basically everyone involved.
Okay, let's start with the public. Closure is enough. I feel like I should be offended by that. Like, are we that simple? Do we just want to be told it's over so we can go back to watching TV?
I don't think it's about being simple. I think it's about trauma. You have to put yourself back in that mindset. From 2001 to 2008, we were exhausted. We had the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, those color-coded terror alerts.
Oh man, I'd forgotten about those.
Right, and the Anthrax scare made people afraid to touch their own mail. That's a very primal violation of your personal safety.
I remember my mom wiping down groceries with bleach. It sounds crazy now, but that anxiety was real.
Exactly. And when you live in that state of high alert for years, you just crave safety. You crave an ending. So when the FBI comes out and says, we got him, it was Bruce Ivans, he acted alone, the threat is gone, the public generally accepts it because we need to accept it. We need to finally exhale. So enough doesn't mean we're stupid. It just means we're tired.
Okay, I can see that. It's emotional survival. So then you have the system. For the system, the source says closure is necessary. We touched on the bureaucracy, but it feels like there's more to it than just paperwork.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about the pressure on the FBI as an institution. For 7 years, they couldn't solve the biggest case in their history. And they had chased the wrong guys. Remember Stephen Hatfill?
Vaguely. They basically ruined his life.
They absolutely did. They named him a person of interest. They trailed him 247. I think they even ran over his foot with a car at one point, and then eventually had to pay him a massive settlement because he had nothing to do with it. That was a huge humiliation for the system.
So by the time they get to Avens, they must have been desperate.
They were bleeding credibility. They were bleeding money. The system, and that means the DOJ, FBI leadership, the White House, it cannot afford another year of we don't know. Closure is necessary for the institution itself to survive, to project competence. Leaving Amerisrax open forever looks like a failure of the state. So the drive for an ending becomes almost existential.
Which brings us to that third player, history. For history, it's complicated.
History is the annoying guy at the party who just won't let it go.
Chuckles, yeah, the guy who actually reads the footnotes.
Exactly. History doesn't have the emotional fatigue of the public. It doesn't care about feeling safe. And history doesn't have the budget constraints or the political pressure of the system.
Yeah.
History has infinite time. So history can sit back, 20 years later, like we are right now, and start looking at all those misfit pieces.
It can look at the dog pieces and say, hey, wait a minute, this puzzle looks wrong.
Right. History is where the nuance lives. It's where we can say, yes, Ivan's was clearly unstable, but the science on the spore production was shaky. History can hold all the contradictions that the system had to smooth over to close the case. That's why it's complicated, because truth, in the long run, usually is. It rarely fits into that neat little box the system built.
It's interesting because we usually think of history as, like, the official record, but you're saying history is actually the correction to the official record.
Ideally, yeah. The official record is the paper ending. History is the attempt to get back to the reality ending.
So we've got this tension between the paper ending and the messy reality. But the source takes it one step further in this final section, and this is where it gets a little ominous for me. It's titled, "The Legacy of Mistakes."
Yeah, this is the so what of the entire document.
The text reads, "This case closed, but its lessons didn't, because systems remember, and so do mistakes." That line, systems remember, it feels like we're talking about Skynet or something.
Yeah.
What does it even mean for a system to have a memory?
It's not science fiction, it's more organizational behavior. A bureaucracy remembers things through protocol. After the Anthrax attacks, the FBI changed everything. They changed how they hire scientists, they changed how they track biological materials, they updated their software, they built brand new labs. That is the system remembering the trauma of the attack. It's building up scar tissue to prevent it from happening again.
Okay, that sounds positive. We want the FBI to learn. We want better protocols.
Theoretically, yes, but then you get the second half of that line, and so do mistakes.
Right. Mistakes remember.
And this is the danger. If the investigation into the Anthrax letters was flawed, if they relied on faulty profiling, or if they developed tunnel vision, or if they learned that it's better to prioritize closing a case over getting every single detail right, then those flaws get baked into the new protocols.
Can you give me a concrete example of that? What kind of mistake gets baked in?
Well, look at the profile they built. They spent years looking for a lone wolf, a disgruntled American scientist acting all alone. They built their entire investigative machine around finding that specific archetype. They pretty much ignored the possibility of, say, state sponsorship or a complex terror cell because it just didn't fit the profile.
And eventually they found Ivans, who did fit the profile.
Or they made the profile fit him. But here's the risk. The lesson the system learned is, when there's a bioterror attack, look for a weird loner in a lab.
So the next time something like this happens.
The next time this happens, the FBI remembers 2001. Its institutional reflex is to immediately start looking for the lone wolf. But what if the next attack isn't a lone wolf? What if it is a sophisticated cell? If the system is remembering a mistake, that the threat is always internal and individual, then they might miss the real threat completely.
They're fighting the last war.
They're fighting the last war. Exactly. And because the Anthrax case was officially closed on paper, that methodology gets validated. The system says, see, it worked. We got Ivans. And so the methodology gets reinforced. The mistake becomes the standard operating procedure.
That is genuinely terrifying. It means that a closed case isn't just an end. It's a seed.
Yes.
You plant the case file in the archives, but the methods you use to build it, they grown into the trees that shade the next investigation.
And if those roots are rotten, the trees could be unstable. The source calls it what never fully closed, because the influence of that investigation is still active today. The FBI agents working right now are using handbooks that were written in the shadow of the Anthrax case, those misfit questions that were ignored back then. They've effectively become invisible spots in the current system's vision.
It really challenges this whole idea of safety. We think we're safe because the bad guy was caught. But if the system learned the wrong lessons from catching him, we might actually be more vulnerable.
That is the paradox right there. Closure brings emotional safety, but if that closure was forced or messy, it might degrade actual systemic safety in the long run.
Man, this is heavy stuff. We started out just talking about a stack of letters back in 2001, and we've ended up questioning the entire nature of institutional memory.
And that's why this source is so valuable. It reminds us that the end is really just a storytelling device. In the real world, nothing ever really ends, it just changes form.
So to recap where we've been, we looked at the difference between the paper ending, the thing the bureaucracy needs, and the reality, which is always full of loose threads. We talked about those misfit questions, the evidence that gets left out because it just doesn't fit the puzzle frame.
And we broke down those different needs. The public needs peace, the system needs resolution, and history needs the complicated truth.
And finally, we landed on this really sobering idea that mistakes had a long, long shelf life.
Yeah.
That the errors of the Anthrax investigation didn't just disappear when Bruce Ivins died, they became part of the FBI's DNA.
And they are likely still influencing decisions being made right now as we speak.
And that's the thought I really want to leave everyone with. We tend to look at 2001 as ancient history. It's a closed chapter. But if mistakes remember, then 2001 is still in the room with us. It's in the protocols. It's in the biases. It's in the blind spots of the people who are supposed to be protecting us today.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What misfit pieces are we ignoring right now in current events, just so we can feel like we have a tidy conclusion?
And are we safer because the system remembers, or are we just trapped in the same loop? Something to think about next time you check the mail. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.